Okay, so the next question I want to pose is where next? The inexorable decline of the West, question mark. John Moynihan, who's chair of PA Consultants, recently argued that the West, by which he means all the developing countries, including Japan, slightly bizarrely since it's hardly in the West, are heading for secular decline. And the essence of this is there's a major discrepancy in wages between the West and the East. The developing economies, including the BRIC countries, are in the East. And this has created a huge job loss from the West to the East, according to Moynihan. Now, prior to the latest wave of globalisation, and in particular the opening up of the economies in the East, this didn't matter. But now, globalisation means that the West and the East are competing directly with each other. Previously, the insularity of the East meant they were not competing directly with each other. But now they're competing directly with each other. And now the huge contrast, the huge wage differentials between the East and the West really matters. And the argument here is that the West, that we are rather ill-equipped to deal with that competition and are suffering as a consequence. And job losses in part reflect wholesale shifts of some industries from the West to the East. We'll see that in a moment. And factors that might have inhibited this process, he argues, are rather weak. Now, the views are controversial, but they are influential. They're not based on rigorous analysis, and he doesn't pretend that they are. They're based on a fairly intuitive case and an outline of slides. And I'm going to present some of his slides now and talk through a little bit of his argument to give you a flavour of where he's coming from. And then I'll step back a little and ask whether we are entirely happy with what he has to say. So what he suggests, his starting point is this, that what he calls the paradigm in the 1900s here should be, basically the idea here is that the government is saying to its electorate, there's an implicit contract, we're going to grow jobs at roughly 2% per annum, we're going to grow your real wages. If you're in a job at roughly 3% per annum, you should be content with this. And the argument is electorates were content with this and were happy with it. In the 2000s, he argues, this has shifted completely. The experience was, in the first decade, anyway, the 2000s, negative employment growth for the West in general, negative real wage growth. So a decline in real wages, a decline in employment, and he's arguing this is just the start of the process. This is going to continue. And why? Because of the competition with the East. So this is the fundamental problem here. We've got the labour pool in advanced economies, 500 million. This is the OECD economies, the West. 500 million. In the developing economies, 1.1 billion actively in the urban labour markets, and then another 1.3 billion who he says are waiting to be urbanised, who are in the rural areas. And the wage differential problem in the OECD in 2010, the average daily wage was $135. In the urban labour market in China, I think it was $12, and in the rural, $1 to $2. So a huge, vast wage differential. He implies a vast differential in competitiveness. And so what he's arguing is this vast differential leads to a loss of jobs. Basically, jobs are moving wholesale to the East from the West and are likely to continue to do so because this differential is not going to close anytime soon. However, he does go through the thought process of asking, well, when will this process come to a halt? In his mind, it comes to a halt when these wages tend to equilibrate, come to the same wage. Now, they've got a hell of a long way to go, and you would need a huge shift of jobs and production before you got to that point. So this is scary indeed. This is a bit scary, the analysis. And here we've got a graph of basically the previous trend growth of employment in both the US and the UK, and he plots what's been happening to growth since the 1990s, the actual growth in employment since the 1990s, and you can see that it's well short of the trend rate of growth, and this is all compatible with the story. Here we've got a graph of the wages of workers of different skill groups. And at the top there in the red, you've got those who've come out of graduate school. This is for the US, and their wages have grown markedly. At the bottom, you've got high school dropouts. Their real wages have actually declined. So this is a manifestation of the distributional impact of globalization combined with skill-intensive technical change. Here's an example of in 1955, the biggest US company was General Motors. And the red block is its US employees, and the grey block are the employees elsewhere, crudely. So the biggest company 2010 was Apple. And the red block is the American employees. The black block are the employees elsewhere. So you've had a huge shift in the nature of employment, in the structure of employment. And in Apple's case, a lot of the employees or contracted employees are based outside of the US. So it's a huge shift in production. This shows the switch in steel production, and the red rectangles there are China. So you've got a big increase in steel production in China and stable elsewhere. So it's not exactly compatible with the view that he's expressing here of a disappearing steel industry, but it's certainly compatible with the view that there's a huge increase in China relative to elsewhere. And this, I'm afraid I can't actually read it from here to remind myself. Right, these are barriers that could prevent job loss from the west to the east, and one of them would be competitive wage rates. So you could have more competitive wage rates. Well, the idea that the west could become competitive with the east in terms of wage rates, given the differential we've just seen, is ridiculous. So it's not feasible. We've got more sophisticated capital stock in the West, but the argument here is this only has a half-life of about 10 to 15 years. So eventually that advantage will unwind. You could compensate for that by investing in new capital, but the argument here is that's not happening, or not happening nearly fast enough. That China invests, and it's true, China invests a much higher proportion of its GDP, getting on for 50% of its GDP, whereas in the West it's much lower than that, less 10 to 15 if we're lucky. So that advantage is going. I think existing IP, there's an argument, there is IP advantages, and the argument here is that a lot of those IP advantages are effectively being stolen from the West, but that's maybe a bit controversial. And the ability to generate IP, he's suggesting this is problematic as well, though that's an area I'll come back to, and not all would agree with that. And this is just simply the kinds of things that could be done, kinds of actions that could be undertaken by governments in order to tackle the issue. So one idea here at the top was changing the composition of government expenditure. In particular, he emphasizes the importance of education, he emphasizes the importance of infrastructure, but he's skeptical about governments being willing to do that. He's talking about curbing the banks, and fair enough, so he's taken a view similar to Krugman, that the banks' power ought to be curbed here, and their ability to repeat the mistakes of the past should be restricted with new reserve requirements and so on. And I think one other argument is that there should be an acceptance of a major and immediate cut in real income on the part of the West, which again he thinks is unlikely to happen, although it is happening gradually through inflation exceeding nominal wage claims. So, okay, so that's the basic thesis, and if we were to believe this, it looks a disaster. So the question really is, are we in the West really all doomed to decades of job losses and zero income growth? The presentation is provocative. Clearly there are elements of exaggeration. I presume you would accept this, the idea of vanishing investment, collapsing education system. Presumably he would accept these were exaggerations. There's also the idea that there is a homogeneous West and a homogeneous East is rather naive, but let's accept the simplification. So for example, Germany's experience is quite distinctive from the UK's and the US's, and it's fared much better during this whole process. So it's not the West as a whole, but some parts of the West, and so there may be interesting questions about why those differences have arisen, and may give us a clue about policy handles that we might pursue in future as well. We could take issue with a number of the policy judgments. He's very conservative in his take small c, but it happens to be large c in this case as well, on Keynesian macro policies, the use of government expenditure to stimulate demand and try and compensate for the recession. He takes a very strict classical view on that. But there's a genuine academic debate on this issue, so it's at one level a respectable position to adopt. But one key issue is Moynihan's focus on the importance of wage, and indeed all labour costs, so pension costs as well, differentials. I mean, labour costs, firstly, are not the only cost of production, so they don't drive cost differentials in and of themselves. But more fundamentally, competition is not simply about costs, as Moynihan sometimes seems to recognise, but he doesn't seem to recognise quite how important it might be to his case. So Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School, he, for example, and many others, believe that widespread outsourcing often has been a mistake. This leads to a hollowing out of US industry, incurring job and income losses, and threatening the key role of the US consumer. The US consumer has, in his view, has a key role in imposing dynamism on companies, being a very demanding set of consumers with a high expectation of rates of innovation in product, and that by hollowing out industry and the loss of income, that this might be a threat to that longer term. Furthermore, it's important to develop industries around local industrial clusters. There are, it's argued, major agglomeration economies from co-location, and these often arise in cities and are part of the reason why cities actually are formed in the first place. So clusters can attract and sustain a pool of very high-skilled labour, for example. It provides you with a proximity to a big customer base and a well-off customer base. It allows you to develop strong links with suppliers and perhaps benefit from their innovation and from their competitive pressure. And this is a kind of localization process, where the developments, where proximity matters and where co-location matters, and these kinds of forces tend to push you towards localization. Now, this doesn't mean that these forces cannot coexist with the forces of globalization. They can. They sometimes pull, well, they are tending to pull in different directions, with globalization leading to a spread outward, agglomeration economies, localization tending to pull you in locally. But this is just an example where you have countervailing forces, and what happens in any particular circumstances will be dependent on the relative strengths of these two things. And companies will be responding to both simultaneously. And an example of success in this respect in the UK is the automotive industry. It's recovered very rapidly and completely from the recession, excellent productivity record, good industrial relations in stark contrast to its early history. The Japanese and other owners of the overseas owners have very good industrial relations, and they have established a very strong Midlands cluster. It's characterized by innovation, high value-added products, and it's a manufacturing success story for the UK, which is in the West. So there are certainly examples of that would appear to contradict Moynihan's thesis here. Okay, conclusions then, very briefly. So what we've seen is internationalization, globalization, and localization raise big and very important, but also rather complex issues. Now, obviously, in a talk of this length, it's only possible to provide a taster of the analysis of these issues, but it's clear that these phenomena, I hope, if nothing else, and the policy responses that we adopt towards these phenomena will have a major impact on all of our futures. So these are really important issues. My hope is that this will stimulate your appetite for a more in-depth look at the relevant theories and evidence that it has been possible to provide here. And what we're trying to do here is analyze phenomena like this and provide a dispassionate analysis of such phenomena in order to provide some kind of appreciation and understanding of what may be appropriate policy responses through theory-informed and evidence-based analysis. And while there are areas here clearly of broad policy agreement, for example, the crucial importance of education and infrastructure is something it looks like most can agree on. The reform of the banking sector. There's no consensus on the detail, because the details of the education reforms required would be controversial. There's no consensus on that, and there's no consensus on even the broad direction for some other things, like the conduct of macro policy, encouraging localization. So what we require is a great deal of further analysis here, and in this and future years in the Strathclyde Business School, that's what we hope to provide. Thank you.